Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we are strapping in for a deep dive that feels less like a research project and more like the plot of a high-budget sci-fi thriller.
It really does.
Only every single element, from the engineered plagues to the psychological architecture of our own minds, has a terrifying real-world parallel.
And that's our mission today, isn't it? To explore this idea of control.
Exactly. External control through weaponized biology, internal control that's lost through trauma and system failure, and then finally, therapeutic control over our own mental processing.
What's so fascinating here, and what our sources really dig into, is how often that boundary between science fiction and science fact
Yeah.
is just blurring, and how fast that's happening.
Absolutely. I mean, we are synthesizing material from YouTube analyses of fictional pandemics like Resident Evil and The Last of Us.
To deeply technical sources on the rabies virus structure, a really complex dual exploration of personal psychosis and societal distrust.
And then we're capping it all off with an extensive look at psychedelic neuropharmacology and modern clinical trials. It's a huge, fascinating scope.
It is. But the underlying narrative is always consistent. It's about who has the power to dictate reality, who loses it when systems, whether they're biological or societal, fail, and how we might regain some of that individual agency.
Right. And our goal is to synthesize all these different perspectives on vulnerability and insight for you, and to show that the technology to create these fictional threats is often much closer than we realize.
So let's jump right in. Part 1, the bioapocalypse.
We have to start with the concept of organized corporate malevolence, right? And nothing epitomizes that better than the fictional Umbrella Corporation from Resident Evil.
Their entire mandate was this perfect self-serving loop. Collect and research deadly viruses, all under the public guise of finding cures.
It's the perfect smokescreen for secretly developing bioorganic weapons. And what the sources highlight is that this whole fictional premise is basically built on a known loophole in international law.
It is. The whole idea of Umbrella operating in the shadows, it rests on the reality of the 1972 Biological Weapons Convention, the BWC.
And that's a real thing, a real United Nations pact that outlaws the development, the production, or stockpiling of biological agents for military use. It's a sweeping, absolutely essential treaty.
It has this critical exception,
Loophole.
the loophole. Research and prophylactic purposes. Umbrella's entire fictional rationale that they need to keep and study these viruses is the exact argument made in the real world to justify keeping some of the deadliest pathogens ever known.
And the classic chilling example that the sources bring up is smallpox.
A total scourge. It had a devastating 30% mortality rate, just unbelievable numbers.
But thanks to these heroic global vaccination campaigns, it was the first human disease ever completely eradicated, wiped off the face of the planet. And that was a monumental triumph for science.
And yet,
Despite that total eradication, we know for a fact that two official, scientifically maintained stocks of the live virus still exist.
one in the United States, at the CDC in Atlanta, and one in Russia at the Vector Institute.
And the official reason is always the same, isn't it? Further research, just in case a sample ever reemerges or is weaponized.
Right, but the sources really stress how divided the scientific community is on this. I mean, it's a bitter debate sometimes.
One side argues that keeping the virus lets us develop next-generation vaccines, therapeutics against engineered variants.
And the other side argues that the biggest bio threat is the very existence of those stocks, that keeping them provides the blueprint, the motivation, and the training opportunity for some malicious actor.
It's the umbrella dilemma, but with 100% real-world stakes. So, moving from the legal framework to the hard science, let's talk about the viral engineering for the fictional T-virus.
Okay, so the T-virus, it was designed to cause rapid, severe brain damage. The result is those mindlessly aggressive creatures we all call zombies.
And the real-world correlation here is incredibly strong. It points directly to the rabies virus.
It really does. I mean, like the fictional Contagion, rabies is passed primarily through infected saliva, a bite.
And that detail is so important because it explains why a character might get bitten once or twice and not instantly turn. Saliva transmission isn't a 100% guarantee. There's what's called a high-miss ratio, which, well, it perfectly mimics how rabies behaves in nature.
And what's fascinating is the sheer breadth of the infection. Rabies naturally infects all warm-blooded species.
Which explains all the different infected creatures you see in the games. The dogs, the bats, even alligators, it's all biologically plausible under a rabies model.
And once that virus reaches the central nervous system, the symptoms just align perfectly. Hyperaggression, cognitive impairment, and that driving, overwhelming compulsion to bite.
That compulsion isn't an accident, though. It's the virus's reproductive strategy. Rabies, Lissa virus rabies, follows this precise three-stage course in the CNS.
It starts with the prodromal stage.
Yeah.
Vague, flu-like symptoms, easy to miss.
But then you get to the second stage, the terrifying, excitative, or furious stage.
And this is where the host becomes hyperreactive, anxious, prone to spasms, and this is the crucial part, extremely aggressive and driven to bite. The virus literally hijacks the host's nervous system and behavioral centers to force the transmission cycle to continue.
The final stage, the paralytic stage, is less cinematic. That's where the host starts to lose muscle control, leading to coma and eventually death.
But for a bioweapon designer, that furious stage is the entire goal. It's a tricky and terrifying viral strategy, all designed for physical passage from one host to the next.
But here's the major functional challenge, and it's why rabies on its own doesn't create a global pandemic.
It's just too slow.
Exactly. It's primarily bite-borne, which is a relatively inefficient way to spread through dense populations. It's not airborne and it's not waterborne like things like SARS or hepatitis or polio, which can use contaminated water or sewage for rapid mass infection.
And this is where the sources get into the really scary engineering side, citing the virologist Smita Andriansky's concept for a theoretical zombie virus cocktail.
The idea isn't to reinvent the wheel, it's to combine key traits using existing viral mechanisms.
Right. You would take the behavioral modification success of rabies, that aggression, the biting compulsion, and you'd fuse it with the transmission efficiency of other viruses.
So you might combine it with the flu virus for airborne capability.
Or maybe measles, for those subtle, widespread personality changes that could mask the initial infection.
Then you'd want to add a strong brain inflammation component, maybe from encephalitis for the aggression and the fever.
And then, for the grand finale, maybe something like Ebola for the internal bleeding and rapid systemic breakdown. That would make the host highly infectious through all their body fluids.
You combine those functional elements, and you have something that very closely models the catastrophic profile of the fictional T virus. It shows that the barriers aren't entirely novel science. They're behavioral and structural limitations we could, theoretically, engineer our way around.
Okay, now let's pivot to the second major fictional pathogen, the Golgotha or G virus from Resident Evil 2.
Right. And this one shifts the focus from mindless aggression to engineered biological enhancement.
It's all about rapid cell growth aimed at perpetual biological immortality, which, when it goes wrong, yields these grotesque mutations. You get these massive, asymmetrical, highly resilient monsters.
And this brings us straight into modern molecular biology and the most powerful tool we have right now, CRISPR.
The fundamental concept of a virus is simple. Inject your own DNA instructions into a host cell to hijack its machinery. CRISPR, which stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeats, is basically the human-designed way to mimic and control that exact process.
Let's break that down a bit for you. Imagine the cell's DNA is a really complex instruction manual. CRISPR is like a pair of programmable molecular scissors.
And its natural purpose is actually cellular defense. It stores bits of viral DNA in the cell's own sequence to recognize and fight future infections. But we've hijacked that mechanism.
So we can now program those molecular scissors to cut and modify any specific sequence of DNA we want. It precisely mimics how a virus works to modify a host's genome.
And the connection to the fictional G virus is just unnervingly close. The G virus is about guiding massive, rapid genetic change. The real-world mechanism uses something called guide RNA, or gRNA.
That's the part that targets and modifies the DNA.
Exactly. And the fact that the G virus acronym and its whole goal predate the common knowledge of this real-world genetic technology by over a decade. It's just a testament to the predictive power of good science fiction.
And the ethical implications, this idea of unintended, horrific consequences, the off-target effects, they're already playing out in the real world.
We've seen gene editing used to create organisms with enhanced physical traits. The genetically modified beagle in China with double the normal muscle mass, for instance.
But the most controversial and alarming case was the genetic modification of human babies in China using CRISPR.
And the widespread criticism wasn't just about the act itself. It was about the immense risks of those off-target effects, unintended mutations in other parts of the genome.
Right.
These unforeseen, potentially monstrous outcomes are the exact real-world analog to the horrific mutations caused by the fictional G virus.
It's not just a biothreat, it's a technological arms race. I mean, the immunologist Daria Unutmaz confirms this. He says, military-level genetic enhancement is not a possibility, it's a certainty.
We are talking about super soldiers, resistant to all known diseases, able to withstand extreme weather, capable of carrying hundreds of kilograms of gear without fatigue.
That level of controlled human enhancement is the logical, terrifying extension of the Umbrella Corporation's ultimate mission.
And the core insight here really is that control over life at the cellular level with CRISPR is now more accessible than political control over its use, like the BWC framework. That's the real danger.
The technology is democratizing way faster than the ethical guardrails are being built.
Okay, so now we shift to what many consider the most virulent pathogen in all of fiction, the cordyceps brain infection, or CBI, from The Last of Us.
What makes this one so compelling is that it's based on a real parasitic fungus, Ophiocordyceps unilateralis, the zombie ant fungus.
We should probably note the species name was updated from cordyceps to Ophiocordyceps, but the process itself is very, very real.
And this parasite is known to wipe out entire social ant colonies, which draws a terrifying parallel to our own densely populated human settlements.
The source material meticulously argues why CBI is scientifically a more potent apocalypse creator than any viral zombie scenario. And it starts with longevity.
Right. Viral hosts, they're driven by fast-acting fever. They usually collapse and die pretty quickly.
But CBI hosts are driven by a resilient fungal organism. They can live for years, deteriorating into creatures like clickers and bloaters. This just fundamentally changes the survival calculus. You can't just wait out the apocalypse if the threat is going to persist for decades.
Second, the incubation period is just perfectly optimized for global spread.
If a virus turns you instantly, containment is easy. If it takes decades, like a prion disease, it's too slow for a real pandemic.
But CBI's ideal incubation of a few hours to a day allows an infected person to get on a plane, travel internationally, and guarantee planetary infection before their symptoms even fully manifest.
And third, you have to consider the ant's natural defenses against the real Ophiocordyceps. They've evolved two main lines of defense.
First, they use a sterilizing hyperparasite fungus. The species isn't identified, but its effect is noted in studies, which attacks the Ophiocordyceps itself and slows its spread.
And more importantly, the colony practices isolation. If an ant shows any sign of infection, it is immediately identified and isolated, or even carried far away from the nest to die. It's brutal, but it prevents colony destruction.
The fictional CBI overcomes both of those barriers. Not only is it biologically more robust than the original ant fungus, but human society just lacks those instinctive, ruthless isolation mechanisms of a social insect colony.
And the transmission methods are superior. It doesn't just spread through bites. It spreads through airborne spores that are released when the infected host dies.
So killing the host in a confined space, like a sewer tunnel or a basement, actually risks spreading the infection even further.
And finally, there's the behavioral difference. Real zombifying parasites tend to use the host passively. They direct it to a specific location for optimal spore dispersal, and then they kill it.
But the CBI hosts actively, aggressively attack and spread the pathogen. This convergence of fungal resilience, efficient incubation, and active aggression, it really makes the fictional fungus the perfect engineered threat.
Before we move on, maybe we should go back to the rabies virus structure for a deeper, more technical look, because it really highlights the kind of precision a bioweapon engineer would want to replicate.
Absolutely. The rabies virus, lysovirus rabies, is structurally elegant. It's a neurotropic rhabdovirus, meaning it specifically targets the nervous system, and it has this distinctive bullet-like shape.
It's enveloped, and it contains a single negative sense RNA genome. It clocks in at around 11,600 to 12,000 nucleotides. I mean, that tiny blueprint contains everything it needs to hijack a complex mammalian system.
And inside that blueprint are the instructions for 5 key proteins: N, P, M, the glycoprotein or G, and the large structural protein L. And we need to understand the division of labor here because it's critical for both infection and vaccine development.
Okay, let's start with the G protein. This is the virus's key. It forms these trimeric spikes on the surface, and it's absolutely essential for receptor binding and membrane fusion. It's literally the process that unlocks and enters the host cell.
So without the G protein, the virus is inert. It just can't propagate.
Exactly. And that's why G is so crucial. It's also the most antigenic site. When your body generates neutralizing antibodies, the G protein is the target. A vaccine that successfully trains your body to recognize G prevents the virus from ever getting into a cell.
So G is the key and the target, but P and L are like the engine room and the security detail, and they work in tandem.
The P, or phosphoprotein, acts as a type I interferon antagonist. Interferon is your body's alarm system against viruses. By blocking it, P essentially prevents your immune system from mounting an effective initial response. It allows the infection to take hold much more rapidly.
And P also serves as the necessary cofactor for the L protein.
Right, L is the massive multifunctional enzyme, the polymerase. L is the factory that reads the RNA genome and produces all the necessary vital components. So P suppresses the immune system and L replicates the virus. They're the perfect hijacking team.
The infection path is just brutal in its efficiency. After a bite, you get some initial localized replication in the muscle tissue. But the game-changing move is what's called retrograde axonal transport.
The virus doesn't just spread through the bloodstream. It literally travels backward along the nerve fibers, reaching the central nervous system incredibly efficiently.
And once it's in the CNS, the virus replicates extensively in the brain, causing those furious symptoms we talked about. And then it spreads outward via the nerves to other organs, crucially, the salivary glands.
And that's the final act. The virus has set up this projectile salivation mechanism in the host's mouth, completing the transmission cycle by ensuring the hyperaggressive host passes the virus along with a bite. It's an elegant systemic weapon.
But our deep understanding of this weapon has led to some surprising therapeutic victories. That knowledge of the rabies genome is now being used for positive applications.
For instance, the virus's ability to travel along nerves is now co-opted in research for viral neuronal tracing. We use it to map out synaptic connections in the brain to understand complex neurological processes.
And even more remarkably, the rabies virus vaccine vector, a modified strain known as the SAD-B19 complex, has been used to create vaccines for entirely different threats.
Right, it was adapted to create Corvaxo for SARS-CoV-2, and it also contributed to an Ebola vaccine, Pheloreb1, which proved to be 100% effective in non-human primates. So the structure of a perfect aggressive controller is now being repurposed as a tool for healing and protection.
That distinction between the architecture of control for destruction and the potential for insight and healing, that leads us perfectly into part 2.
If part 1 showed us the vulnerability of our biological architecture to these engineered external threats, part 2 is going to explore the equivalent vulnerability of our mental architecture when trust, the very operating system of society, collapses.
Our source material here presents a startling, and I'll say difficult, juxtaposition. It's a deeply personal narrative of trauma, self-created metaphysics, and profound distrust, placed right alongside a critique of widespread societal distrust in public health and political systems.
And both of these narratives, though they're coming from very different places, ultimately resort to the same defense mechanism.
Yeah.
Self-created, highly structured reality construction.
In the personal narrative, the crisis is rooted in deep structural failure. We're talking profound disappointment, early trauma, and a deeply troubling account involving alleged sexual assault while under psychiatric care.
And this resulted in a fundamental, and you could say justified, distrust of the very systems that are meant to offer stability. It was fueled by alleged cover-ups and what were perceived as fraudulent documents.
And when that external reality, the people and institutions you rely on for safety, proves unreliable or even harmful, the mind doesn't just break down. It seeks to impose a new, reliable order.
The author describes seeing geometric shapes as visual stand-ins for reality. It's essentially developing a sophisticated symbolic language to replace the failed verbal and social language of trust.
And this search for a stable logic leads to these astonishing cognitive frameworks, like the attempt to create a four-dimensional thought construction.
And that's not just a metaphor, it's an intellectual survival tool. The source describes it as a self-created operating system used to observe reality, analyze sentence bias in conversation, and simulate 4D geometric paradigms to interpret consciousness and predict future events.
It's an incredibly intricate, highly structured mechanism designed to achieve absolute predictability in what has become an unpredictable, traumatizing world.
This drive then extends into these sweeping, grand metaphysical theories. The author contemplates parallel realities, multiple futures, and the idea that the universe expands because of a constant energy exchange between these dimensions.
Matter itself is conceptualized not as a solid foundation, but as an anomaly that stems from relativity's contradictions. The world is viewed abstractly as a sophisticated, calculating machine, or maybe a simulation that's running imperfectly.
It just speaks to this desperate need to find a flawless, logical framework when human interaction has failed so profoundly.
But the most radical philosophical conclusion presented is the view of perception as a psychosis of reality.
It suggests that our shared consensus reality might itself be distorted or flawed relative to some purer underlying consciousness. It completely inverts the clinical diagnosis. Maybe the world is broken, not the observer.
This intense intellectual structure, though, it causes immense personal conflict. There's this feeling of being constantly held back by incoherent mental health care, the fear of manipulation.
And the overwhelming fear that sharing these profound internal experiences only leads to more medication, which is seen as suppressing what the author perceives as spiritual gifts or a kind of heightened awareness.
The core paradox is that the intellect, which is seeking safety through supreme control and structure, is now actively at war with the established system that labels that very structure as a pathology.
Now let's shift to the external societal critique, which mirrors this theme of profound distrust but plays out on a global stage. We're looking at the observations of Jan Bonte, who tracks this shift in what he calls societal psychosis post-COVID.
Bonte observes that the public's focus and fear have sort of transitioned from a single biological threat, COVID, to a perceived unifying need for large-scale conflict, specifically war with Russia.
He questions the motivations, asking if financial and geopolitical motives are now trumping a genuine assessment of threat, or if society just requires a constant external crisis to unify itself.
This systemic distrust leads directly into the difficult terrain of concerns raised in the source material regarding adverse events post-vaccination.
And we must be very clear here that our role is to impartially report on the specific claims and observations contained within our source material. We're maintaining neutrality regarding established scientific consensus versus the claims being reported.
The source material specifically reports on anecdotal and observational cases that are said to fuel this distrust. One case details a 23-year-old man who died after neurosurgery, with subsequent findings of widespread vascular inflammation and the presence of spike protein in both his brain and tests.
Another anecdote concerns a 16-year-old girl who reportedly died of myocarditis following her second dose, with spike protein allegedly found in her ovaries and in the vaccination arm muscle.
Broader observational concerns discussed in the source material relate to autopsy findings indicating vasculitis, that's inflammation of blood vessels, and the persistent presence of spike protein in various organs of some deceased vaccinated individuals.
The analysis notes that these findings might be easily dismissed by critics as being attributable to age or pre-existing conditions, if not for a diligent post-mortem investigation by specific researchers.
Furthermore, the discussion flags concerns about potential long-term unknowns stemming from components used in some vaccines. The source specifically mentions the presence of the SV40 promoter, which it identifies as a known oncogene, a cancer-causing gene.
Right, and it expresses worry that this raises questions about potential long-term cancer risks and the possibility of viral DNA contamination in certain batches.
There is also discussion within the source material concerning the difficulty in establishing a clear correlation versus causation when observing phenomena like declining birth rates in highly vaccinated countries.
The sources note that while the presence of spike protein has been found in reproductive organs tests and ovaries in some cases, proving this correlation leads to a specific causative long-term effect remains a massive, unresolved scientific hurdle.
And the sources emphasize that these concerns, whether they're scientifically validated in the long run or not, contribute significantly to the broader narrative of distrust in public health agencies that demand universal compliance but fail to address these specific safety claims transparently.
The unifying theme between these two starkly different narratives, the traumatized individual constructing a 4D reality and the segment of society constructing a narrative of systemic conspiracy and failure, is a shared, profound distrust in established, powerful systems.
When the mental health system fails the individual, or when the government or medical complex is perceived as manipulative, the drive for individual inquiry and the construction of an alternative, often highly structured, reality becomes the primary defense mechanism.
It's the ultimate expression of the need for internal control when the external control systems are deemed compromised or even actively hostile. And this intellectual effort to replace chaos with a personal, complex structure is exactly what we seek to address in a therapeutic context with our final section.
That brings us to part 3, which looks at the controlled alteration of the mind using psychedelics. a deliberate, safe attempt to dismantle rigid thought patterns, essentially reversing the architecture of control that the traumatized mind builds to protect itself.
This is really a story of science finally reclaiming a long-censored history.
And the history here is immense. It spans millennia. Psychedelics have been used across cultures for generations for understanding, personal growth, well-being, healing.
We have examples like the ritual use of peyote and San Pedro, which contain mescaline, the ceremonial use of ayahuasca with DMT, magic mushrooms with psilocybin.
And even the hypothesized use of the ancient Greek kykeon drink, which may have contained ergot mixed with wine. It suggests deep philosophical use even in Western classical history.
And this practice wasn't just ritualistic, it was philosophically grounded. Aldous Huxley, reflecting on his own experiences with mescaline, proposed the theory that the human brain acts as a reducing valve.
A necessary filter to limit the flow of consciousness to only what is functionally necessary for daily survival. And psychedelics, in this view, open that valve.
It's the idea that William Blake captured. If the doors of perception were cleansed, everything would appear to man as it is, infinite. The brain's job is to make the infinite manageable and finite.
Trauma or rigid thinking can narrow that valve way too much, making perspective impossible.
The modern research boom really took off in the 1950s and 60s after Albert Hofmann discovered LSD. And this wasn't some marginal science. Hundreds of leading psychiatrists were involved.
We're talking about 1,000 clinical papers published and reports on 40,000 patients treated, with results that were overwhelmingly described as safe and highly effective.
Two primary treatment models emerged. You had psychedelic psychotherapy, favored in the U.S., which involved a single high-dose session aimed at a mystical or breakthrough experience.
And then there was psycholytic psychotherapy, more popular in Europe, which used frequent low doses combined with talk therapy. Both showed a lot of promise for alcoholism, depression, and anxiety.
But this era just crashed hard, and it wasn't because of scientific failure.
No. Pooled analyses from that time showed incredibly low adverse event rates. Prolonged psychosis was reported in only 0.2% of sessions, and suicide was just 0.04%.
But despite that safety profile, the counterculture movement and the anti-Vietnam War protests became inextricably linked to these drugs.
And this political association led directly to the 1967 U.S. ban and the 1971 UN conventions, which classified psychedelics into Schedule I.
That's the label: highly dangerous, addictive, and having no medical use. This ban, driven by political reasons supported by dishonest or fabricated science, is considered by many leading experts today as the worst censorship of any research in the history of the world.
And the irony is just devastating. That classification remains today for many of these substances, yet modern expert analysis consistently shows compounds like psilocybin and LSD rank among the lowest in terms of overall harm to users and others.
They're categorized well below common things like alcohol, heroin, cocaine, even cannabis on common harm scales.
Yeah.
It's a powerful historical injustice that current research is finally starting to correct.
So how do they work structurally? Let's get into the neuropharmacology.
All classic serotonergic psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, which converts to psilocin in the body, mescaline, DMT, they all share a core mechanism. They are highly effective 5-HT2A receptor agonists.
And why does that matter? Well, it's because the human brain has the highest density of these 5-HT2A receptors compared to any other brain we know of.
And they are overwhelmingly concentrated in the most recently evolved part of our cortex, the transmodal cortex. This region is responsible for high-level integration, abstract thought, and often self-reflection.
The acute effect is the creation of what's called the entropic brain state. Unlike sedatives, which synchronize and quiet brain activity, psychedelics cause massive depolarization, and they desynchronize brain activity across different networks.
It's like shaking a snow globe. This radically increases global brain connectivity, essentially acting like a temporary neurological reset. It's sometimes analogized to the highly plastic, unrestricted thinking of a child's brain.
And this increase in global connectivity is precisely what allows for new solutions to emerge for old, intractable problems. It generates the profound insights reported by patients. The rigid structures built by the mind, like that four-dimensional thought construction we discussed, are temporarily dissolved.
And this directly relates to their therapeutic application in what are called internalizing disorders, most notably depression.
Depression is characterized by excessive self-referential thought and harmful rumination. In this condition, the default mode network, or DMN, is hyperconnected and overactive. The DMN is the driver of that endless loop of self-criticism.
Let's quickly define the DMN components for you. It's composed of key hubs like the posterior cingulate cortex, or PCC, which is a major hub for self-referential thought.
And the subgenual cingulate cortex, or SCC, which is involved in emotional processing and mood regulation.
And in depression, the functional connectivity between these regions is pathologically strong. It actually predicts the severity of rumination.
And psilocybin actively works to uncouple the DMN. It temporarily dissolves those strong functional correlations, particularly that rigid connection between the PCC and the SCC. It's literally breaking down the physical architecture of rigid thinking patterns.
It stops the brain from endlessly repeating the same self-critical loop.
And the effects aren't just transient. The concept of psychedelics as psychoplastogens speaks to the long-term structural changes they can induce.
Right. They demonstrably increase neurite growth, new branches from neurons, spine density, and synaptogenesis, which is new connections between neurons. This structural plasticity provides a physical mechanism for the sustained improvement in mood and cognitive flexibility we see in patients weeks after the initial dose.
This brings us to the modern clinical model, which is highly structured and professional. It's moved far beyond the counterculture free-for-all.
It involves rigorous eligibility assessments, weeks of psychological preparation, and a necessary withdrawal of common psychiatric medications.
The crucial step is the high-dose dosing day, typically a 6 to 8 hour session in a comfortable, supportive clinical setting, often with 2 trained psychological guides present.
And this is followed by sustained psychological support for integration, sometimes lasting 6 weeks or more. The drug is the catalyst. The therapy is the change agent.
And the results of the recent comparative trial of psilocybin versus escitalopram, a common SSRI antidepressant, are extremely important. They show a difference not just in efficacy, but in the quality of recovery.
At the 6-week mark, while both groups showed sustained improvement, psilocybin demonstrated statistically superior improvements in measures of well-being, specifically on scales like the WE-MWBS.
And it showed a greater overall reduction in depression scores across multiple objective measures like QUDS, BDI, and HAM-D.
Moreover, psilocybin showed better tolerability regarding common side effects, especially those related to sleep and gut measures, which are notorious complaints for SSRI users.
But the critical insight is the shift in patient experience. SSRIs often work by emotionally blunting the patient. They dampen the peaks and troughs of feeling, creating a sort of passive, mediated coping mechanism.
One patient's reflection just perfectly captures the paradigm shift. They said, "Where escitalopram nulled me to be less scared, psilocybin has made me realize that fear is not something to be feared."
It's a shift from pharmaceutical suppression to genuine psychological realization and integration. The fear is still there, but the relationship to it has completely changed.
And we should note the interesting finding about expectation. Though patients had higher expectations for the novel psilocybin treatment, the data show that the effects of patient expectancy were only statistically significant in the escitalopram arm.
Which suggests the clinical benefit of psilocybin was likely driven by genuine pharmacological and neurological changes, rather than just the placebo effect of a cool new treatment.
Beyond depression, the source material details the incredible progress with MDMA, often called ecstasy for trauma-related disorders like PTSD.
MDMA was invented way back in 1904. It was illicitly used by psychotherapists in the 70s before being banned based on fabricated evidence about neurotoxicity in 1985. Another example of political censorship overriding scientific utility.
MDMA is now back in trials because its pharmacology is uniquely suited for trauma therapy and, importantly, it is not addictive. It promotes a massive release of serotonin, or 5-HT, and blocks its reuptake, creating that feeling of connection and empathy.
Crucially, it predominantly releases serotonin, not dopamine, which is the primary driver of addiction in substances like methamphetamine.
MDMA-assisted psychotherapy helps PTSD patients specifically because it acts on the brain's stress circuitry. It reduces activity in the limbic system, particularly the hyperactive amygdala, the fear center, and the hippocampus, which is involved in memory formation.
By dampening the brain's core fear response centers, the patient is able to access, process, and cope with highly emotional traumatic memories during therapy without being overwhelmed by panic.
This facilitates the necessary process of exposure leading to extinction of fear and anxiety responses, allowing the traumatic memory to finally be filed away as something that happened, rather than something that is perpetually happening.
The outcome data for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD is just dramatic. It shows a far steeper and more sustained decline in the percentage of subjects who qualify for a PTSD diagnosis compared to psychotherapy alone.
And this extensive body of modern, rigorous research has finally begun to force political and public change. It shows the power of science to overcome decades of censorship.
The breakthrough occurred in July 2023, when the Australian FDA equivalent made a historic move, rescheduling both psilocybin and MDMA to allow their use for treatment-resistant depression and PTSD, respectively, under controlled medical supervision.
So what does this all mean? We've taken a journey across the architecture of control. We've seen that the technology to create sci-fi pathogens is here, from the precision of CRISPR to the behavioral manipulation of rabies, increasing our external biovulnerability.
We've examined how our established systems face these profound challenges to trust, forcing the internal construction of hyperstructured realities as a defense mechanism.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, all these topics orbit the idea of control in information flow. Whether it's genetic information with CRISPR, neurological information with the DMN rumination loop, or societal information with geopolitical and health narratives.
The core insight seems to be that the democratization of biotechnology is increasing the chaos and threats externally.
While these ancient therapeutic tools are now being used to address the rigidity caused by internal chaos, tools like psychedelics aim to increase individual agency by fundamentally reshaping internal experience.
They force the mind to break down the protective but ultimately crippling structures it built to cope with trauma and fear, promoting cognitive flexibility and psychological health.
We detailed how the traumatized mind can, in its isolation, create its own complex four-dimensional reality structures to impose order. We also know that psychedelics disrupt the brain's default operating system to foster new connections by inducing an entropic brain state, a state of controlled chaos in the brain.
This raises a pretty important question. If the mind's natural defense against external chaos is to build rigid internal architecture, could this concept of controlled chaos in the brain, this therapeutic dissolution of structure, be a fundamental prerequisite for profound human healing and self-knowledge, and the key to rebuilding agency in a world that is defined by vulnerability?
That is definitely something to mull over.